In the dimly lit Iron Horse Bar in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a decorated combat veteran was about to face unexpected discrimination on home soil. What started as a simple reunion dinner took a shocking turn when he encountered blatant prejudice. Dexter Watts wasn't your typical customer. For 6 years, he had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, known for his Purple Heart and unwavering courage. When bar owner Danny Kowalski refused him service despite empty stools, Dexter had no idea he was walking into a viral moment. His dignified response would lead to national outrage. What began as one man's prejudice would become a community reckoning, transforming enemies into allies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The neon sign of the Iron Horse flickered against the November cold, casting amber light across Main Street's cracked sidewalks. Inside, the familiar rhythm of a Tuesday evening played out. Steelworkers hunched over their beers, retirees nursing whiskey, while the Steelers game flickered silently on 3 mounted TVs. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from men who've known each other's stories for decades. Danny Kowalski moved behind the bar with practiced efficiency, polishing glasses that didn't need polishing, his movements as automatic as breathing. 42 years old and showing every one of them in the lines around his eyes, he'd inherited more than just the Iron Horse from his father. He'd inherited the weight of keeping a dying institution alive in a dying town. The bar had been in the Kowalski family for 3 generations, weathering steel mill closures, economic downturns, and the slow exodus of young people who saw nothing for them in Millbrook's rust-stained streets. The bell above the door chimed, and Danny looked up from his glass-polishing routine. A man stood in the doorway, scanning the room with the careful assessment of someone used to evaluating threats and exits. Mid-30s maybe, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of posture that spoke of military training, but it was the way he moved that made Danny's stomach clench. The careful placement of his right leg, the subtle shift of weight that spoke of a prosthetic beneath dark jeans. Dexter Watts stepped fully into the bar's amber glow, and Danny caught sight of the scars that ran along the left side of his face, pale lines against dark skin that disappeared beneath his collar. The man's eyes swept the room methodically before settling on Danny, and something in that gaze, alert, controlled, measuring, sent Danny's mind spiraling backward to childhood memories he'd spent 40 years trying to bury. Dad's eyes. The same look Dad had when he came back from the war, always watching, always ready for something to go wrong. "Evening," Dexter said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He approached the bar with that careful gait, and Danny found himself gripping the glass in his hand so tightly his knuckles went white. "I'm supposed to meet some friends here. Mind if I grab a seat while I wait?" The reasonable request should have been answered with automatic hospitality. Danny had served thousands of customers over the years, had poured drinks for strangers, and regulars alike without a second thought. But something about this man, the military bearing, the visible evidence of combat, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite obvious injuries, triggered every buried fear Danny had about broken soldiers and the violence they brought home with them. We're full up tonight," Danny heard himself say, the lie falling from his lips before conscious thought could stop it. Around the bar, conversation had died. 6 empty stools sat in plain sight. The lie hung in the air like smoke, obvious and damning. Dexter's eyes didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Not aggressive, never that, but the stillness of someone who'd heard variations of this rejection before. "Full up," he repeated, not a question, but an acknowledgement. His gaze swept the obviously empty seats, then returned to Danny's face. "I see. "Look, it's nothing personal," Danny said, the words tumbling out in a rush of justification. "It's just, we've got regulars coming in and—" "Nothing personal," Dexter echoed, and there was something in his voice that made Danny's excuse die in his throat. The veteran reached into his jacket pocket, movement slow and deliberate, and withdrew a small purple heart medal attached to a simple keychain. He placed it gently on the bar's scarred wooden surface. "I served 3 tours in Iraq," Dexter said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent bar. "Lost my leg and 2 good friends to an IED outside Fallujah. Got this for bleeding on foreign soil, so folks back home could sit in bars like this one and decide who deserves service." The medal caught the amber light, a small piece of metal that seemed to weigh more than everything else in the room combined. Danny stared at it, feeling the eyes of every patron boring into him. In the corner booth, his son Tommy looked up from his textbook, his 19-year-old face a mask of confusion and growing shame. "You sure you don't have room for one more?" Dexter asked, and there was no anger in his voice, no challenge, just a quiet dignity that made Danny's chest tight with something he couldn't name. Danny's mouth opened, but no words came. His father's voice echoed in his memory, shouting, breaking things, the sound of his mother crying behind closed doors. "They come back wrong," some part of his mind whispered. "They come back broken and dangerous, and they never really come home." "I think you'd better leave," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dexter nodded once, a slight dip of his head that somehow conveyed more disappointment than anger ever could. He picked up his purple heart, tucked it back into his pocket, with the same careful movements. "You know," he said, meeting Danny's eyes one last time, "my unit's having our annual reunion tonight. First time I've been back to my hometown since I got hurt. Figured it would be nice to show them where I grew. Show them the kind of place worth fighting for." The words hit Danny like physical blows. Around the bar, grown men stared into their drinks, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Tommy Kowalski's textbook lay forgotten as he watched his father refuse service to a decorated veteran in their family's bar, a bar that had served 3 generations of military families, including his own grandfather. Dexter turned toward the door, his gait steady despite the prosthetic. He paused with his hand on the door handle. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I wasn't looking for special treatment, just wanted to buy a beer and wait for my friends, same as anyone else." The bell chimed again as the door closed behind him, leaving the Iron Horse in a silence so profound that the muted television seemed deafeningly loud. Danny stood frozen behind the bar, the polishing rag still in his hands, watching through the window as Dexter Watts disappeared into the November night. "Jesus Christ, Danny," someone muttered from the corner. Old Pete Kowalski, whose own son had done 2 tours in Afghanistan. What the hell was that about? Danny couldn't answer. His throat felt thick, choked with regret and a shame so deep it made his bones ache. He wanted to run after the veteran, wanted to apologize, wanted to explain about his father and the nightmares and the way broken soldiers had shaped his childhood fears. But pride and terror held him frozen behind the bar that had been his family's legacy for 70 years. Tommy closed his textbook with a sharp snap that echoed through the silence. When he looked at his father, his eyes held a disappointment that cut deeper than any stranger's judgment ever could. Outside, Dexter Watts walked into the cold November night, carrying his dignity like armor and his rejection like a fresh wound. Behind him, the Iron Horse stood unchanged. Same neon sign, same amber light, same men nursing the same drinks. But something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Danny Kowalski continued polishing his glass, the motion automatic and meaningless, while his mind raced with justifications that sounded hollow even to himself. In the corner, Tommy gathered his books and headed for the door without a word, his silence more damning than any accusation. The Steelers game played on, but nobody was watching anymore. 3 blocks from the Iron Horse, Dexter Watts pushed through the glass door of Millbrook Diner, the bell's cheerful chime a stark contrast to the silence he'd left behind. The familiar smell of coffee and grease wrapped around him like a threadbare blanket from childhood, but the comfort felt hollow now. He chose a corner booth that offered clear sightlines to both entrances, old habits from a war that never really ended, and slid across the cracked vinyl seat with the careful precision of someone still learning to trust a prosthetic leg. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and tired feet, approached with a coffee pot already in hand. "You're Maggie Watts's boy, aren't you? Dexter." When he nodded, her smile became genuine. "Haven't seen you since before you shipped. Out coffee? Please." He accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping his hands around its warmth. Through the diner's front window, he could see the Iron Horse's neon sign 3 blocks away, its amber glow an accusation in the November darkness. His phone buzzed against the table. Elena Rodriguez, as always, arriving exactly on time. 5 minutes out. Everything good. Dexter stared at the text, his thumb hovering over the keypad. "How did you explain to your former squad leader that your own hometown had just rejected you, that the place you dreamed about during 3 tours in hell didn't want you back?" Slight change of plans, meeting here instead. Millbrook Diner on Oak Street. Her response came immediately. "Roger that. Everything okay? We'll explain when you get here." He pocketed the phone and took a sip of coffee that tasted like memories. This booth. He'd sat here with his mother before his first deployment, promising her he'd come home safe. He had come home, technically. Most of him, anyway. The parts that mattered were still buried under a pile of rubble outside Fallujah, along with Martinez and Johnson, and the easy laughter they'd shared in the moments before the world exploded. The familiar weight of survivors' guilt settled on his shoulders like body armor he couldn't remove. 3 years since the blast, and he still woke up some mornings surprised to be breathing when better men weren't. Martinez had a daughter who was learning to walk. Johnson was going to propose to his girlfriend when they got home. Instead, Dexter got to sit in this diner with a Purple Heart in his pocket and the taste of rejection bitter on his tongue. Another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Elena's truck, followed closely by Jake Williams's modified Honda. Through the window, Dexter watched his family, the one he'd chosen in blood and sand, climbing out of their vehicles with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to move as one unit. Elena Rodriguez, 38 years old, and still carrying herself like she could take on the world's problems single-handed. Jake Radar Williams, communications specialist turned civilian tech worker, his laptop bag slung over one shoulder like a soldier's pack. Doc Martinez arrived next. Ashley, not the Martinez who'd died in the blast, but the medic who'd kept Dexter alive long enough for the medevac helicopter to find him. She moved with the confident stride of someone who'd seen the worst the human body could endure and still believed in healing. Elena entered first, her sharp eyes immediately cataloguing the diner's layout, exits, and potential threats, another habit that didn't die with discharge papers. Her gaze found Dexter in his corner booth, and something in his posture must have communicated the evening's events, because her expression shifted from reunion joy to combat alertness in seconds. "What happened?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him, with Jake and Doc flanking her sides. No pleasantries, no small talk. Elena had always been able to read her soldiers like tactical manuals. Dexter found himself studying the coffee stains on the table. "Ran into some local hospitality issues." "Define issues," Doc said, her voice carrying the edge it got when one of her people was hurt. 26 years old, and she still considered every member of their unit her personal responsibility. "The Iron Horse," Dexter said quietly. "Owner decided they were full up when I walked in." He looked up to meet Elena's eyes. 6 empty, bar stools, but apparently not enough room for a vet with a limp. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded explosive decompression, dangerous and absolute. Jake's fingers had stopped their usual fidgeting with his phone. Doc's hands were flat on the table, steady as they'd been when she'd worked. To stop arterial bleeding, Elena's expression had gone to that place it went during firefights, calm and calculating and utterly lethal. "Full up," Elena repeated, her voice quiet in the way that made enemy combatants surrender. "In your hometown, on reunion night. It's not worth—" Dexter began. "The hell it's not," Doc interrupted, her protective instincts flaring. "You bled for this country. You lost your leg for these people, and some bartender thinks he can just—" "Easy, Doc," Elena said, but her tone suggested she shared the sentiment. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving across the screen with military efficiency. "Jake, how many of the unit are en route?" 12 total, including us," Jake responded automatically. "Gunny's driving down from Pittsburgh, should be here in 30. The rest are scattered between here and an hour out." Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Perfect timing. She looked up from her phone. "Dexter, was this bartender wearing anything that identified him as the owner?" "Name tag said Danny Kowalski. Why?" "Because," Elena said, standing up with the fluid motion of someone preparing for battle, "I think it's time Danny Kowalski learned what it means to disrespect a Purple Heart recipient." She gestured to Jake. "Start recording. Document everything. This needs to be witnessed." "Elena," Dexter said, recognizing the tone that had gotten them through 3 combat tours. "I don't want trouble." "Brother," she replied, using the word that bound them tighter than blood. "Trouble already found you. We're just going to introduce ourselves properly." She checked her watch. "Give me 15 minutes to coordinate with the others. Then we're going to pay the Iron Horse a visit." Doc leaned forward, her medic's eyes scanning Dexter's face for signs of distress. "You sure you're okay with this? We don't have to—" "No," Dexter said, something hardening in his voice. "You're right. This isn't just about me." He thought. About other veterans who might walk into that bar, who might face the same rejection, who might not have a unit to watch their 6. Maybe it's time Millbrook learned the difference between putting flags on their cars and actually supporting the people who served under them. Elena's phone buzzed with incoming messages, the rest of their unit confirming their arrival times, their locations, their readiness to stand with their brother. "Jake, I want you streaming this live, full transparency. Let people see what really happens when a decorated veteran comes home." Outside the diner's windows, more vehicles were pulling into the parking lot. Familiar faces emerged from trucks and cars, men and women who'd shared foxholes and nightmares, who'd promised to watch each other's backs long after the shooting stopped. They moved with unconscious coordination toward the diner's entrance, drawn by the same loyalty that had kept them alive in a war zone. "You know," Dexter said, watching his family assemble, 3 years ago, I thought the hardest part of coming home would be learning to walk again." Elena Rodriguez smiled, and it was the smile she'd worn before every successful mission they'd ever run. "Shows what we know about the home front, doesn't it?" Through the window, the Iron Horse's neon sign flickered against the November night, unaware that 12 combat veterans were about to teach its owner the true meaning of service. The silence hit the Iron Horse like a physical force when 12 soldiers in dress blue uniforms walked through the door in perfect formation. Their boots struck the worn wooden floor in unison, each step deliberate and measured. The muted television seemed to grow louder in the sudden quiet, Terry Bradshaw's commentary echoing absurdly over the frozen tableau. Danny Kowalski's hands stilled on the beer tap he'd been cleaning, his knuckles white against the chrome handle. The glass in his grip trembled slightly as his eyes swept across the formation, medals gleaming under the bar's amber lighting. Ribbons telling stories of deployments he'd never understand. Faces bearing the calm authority that only comes from seeing hell and walking back out. Sergeant First Class Elena Rodriguez stepped forward from the center of the formation, her bearing impeccable despite the tension radiating from her shoulders. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd led soldiers through 3 combat deployments, her dark eyes fixed on Danny with surgical precision. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. "I'm Sergeant First Class Rodriguez. These are my soldiers." She gestured to the formation behind her without breaking eye contact. "We're here about Dexter Watts." Danny's throat felt like sandpaper. He could feel the weight of every patron's stare, the way conversations had died mid-sentence, the way even old Pete Morrison had turned away from his perpetual corner stool to watch. Behind the bar, his son Tommy had gone pale, recognizing several faces from the photographs Dexter had shown him at the hardware store. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Danny started, but Elena raised one gloved hand. "Neither do we." Her tone remained level, professional. "We're here because 37 minutes ago you refused service to a decorated combat veteran, a man who took shrapnel in his leg and back saving 2 of my soldiers, a man who spent 8 months in Walter Reed, learning to walk again." She paused, letting the words settle. "We'd like to understand why." The formation behind her remained motionless, but Danny could feel their collective presence like heat from a forge. He recognized the stocky red-haired soldier on Elena's. Left from news footage, Jake Williams, the one they called Radar, who'd been live-streaming their entire approach. The phone in his hand was angled perfectly to capture both Eleanor and Danny's face. "I told him we were full up," Danny said, his voice cracking slightly. "Nothing personal. Full up." Elena's eyes swept the bar, taking in the dozen empty stools, the vacant tables, the obvious lie hanging in the air like cigarette smoke. "Mr. Kowalski, I've been to 43 countries and every state in this union. I know what full up looks like. This isn't it." A murmur ran through the other patrons. Bill Hendricks, who'd been nursing the same beer for an hour, suddenly found his glass fascinating. Mary Sullivan, the town's former mayor, shifted uncomfortably in her booth, no longer able to pretend this was someone else's problem. Danny's face flushed red. "You can't come in here and we're not here to threaten anyone," Elena interrupted. "We're here because a brother was hurt, not by enemy fire, not by an IED, by the people he served to protect." Her voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment. "Help me understand that, Mr. Kowalski." Behind Elena, Doc Martinez took a half-step forward, her jaw clenched. At 28, Ashley Martinez had patched up more wounded soldiers than most emergency room doctors, and her protective instincts were barely contained beneath her military bearing. Elena sensed the movement and shot her a warning glance. "You want to know why?" Danny's voice rose, years of buried resentment suddenly spilling out. "Because every time I see one of you people, I see my old man coming home drunk and mean, taking his war out on my mother and me, because I'm tired of everyone acting like wearing a uniform makes you some kind of hero when half of you come back broken and dangerous." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably, recognizing echoes of their own unspoken thoughts. But Elena's expression didn't change. "Your father served in Vietnam," she said. It wasn't a question. "Drafted, spent 2 years in hell and brought it back with him." Danny's hand shook now. "Died when I was 16, liver gave out. But not before he taught me what war really does to people. And you think that gives you the right to judge us all? I think it gives me the right to protect my customers and my family." Elena nodded slowly, processing this. Around the formation, her soldiers remained statue still, but she could feel their anger like a living thing. Jake's phone captured every word, the viewer count climbing steadily as the confrontation unfolded. "Sergeant Williams," Elena said without turning around. "Mom, How many viewers are we up to? Approaching 8,000, ma'am? Comments are coming in from all 50 states. Danny's face went white. You're filming this? Yes, sir, Jake replied. Figured people might want to see how Millbrook, Pennsylvania treats its Purple Heart recipients. The door chimed again, and Lieutenant Colonel Harrison entered, his weathered face grave. At 55, he commanded respect through presence alone. 30 years of service had carved authority into his very bones. The soldiers snapped to attention, automatically. As you were, Harrison said quietly, then addressed Elena. Sergeant Rodriguez, report. Sir, we're discussing Mr. Kowalski's refusal to serve Sergeant Watts due to his veteran status and visible injuries. Harrison's grey, eyes fixed on Danny with the intensity of a targeting laser. Mr. Kowalski, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. I've known Dexter Watts for 6 years. He's one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command. When his Humvee hit that IED outside Baghdad, he stayed conscious long enough to apply tourniquets to both his wounded teammates before allowing the medics to treat his own injuries. The doctor said his actions saved their lives. Danny swallowed hard. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Harrison interrupted. You saw scars and a prosthetic leg and made assumptions. You saw a uniform and decided we were all damaged. Goods. He stepped closer to the bar. But you know what? You're right about one thing. War does change people. It shows us what we're really made of, and apparently it shows civilians what they're made of too. The live stream had reached 12,000 viewers now, comments flooding in faster than Jake could read them. Local news stations were already reaching out to their stringers, sensing a story with national implications. Elena stepped back, her mission accomplished. We didn't come here for an apology, Mr. Kowalski. We came here so you'd have to look us in the eye and explain yourself. So your neighbors could see who you really are when nobody's watching. So the whole country could see how Millbrook, Pennsylvania really treats its veterans. She turned to her formation. Detail, face left, forward, march. The soldiers executed the movement with parade ground precision, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. As they reached the door, Elena paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Mr. Kowalski, I'm sorry your father didn't get the help he needed when he came home. But that's not on us. That's on people like you, who'd rather ignore the problem than face it. The door closed behind them with a soft chime, leaving the Iron Horse in devastating silence. Danny stood behind his bar, exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights, while Jake's live stream continued broadcasting to an audience that had swelled to 15,000 viewers and counting. The Steelers game played on, but nobody was watching anymore. In the corner, Pete Morrison finally broke the silence. Jesus, Danny, what the hell did you just do? By 6 a.m., Jake Williams' livestream had been shared 47,000 times across Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. The video, 11 minutes and 37 seconds of raw confrontation, had been clipped, remixed, and dissected by millions of viewers hungry for justice and outrage in equal measure. Millbrook shame was trending nationally, sandwiched between celebrity gossip and political scandals. Maria Jenner's phone had been buzzing since 4:30 a.m. when CNN's overnight producer tracked down her number through the Millbrook Gazette's website. As the town's only full-time journalist, she'd become the de facto spokesperson for a community that had never asked for national attention. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, as she fielded calls from Good Morning America, Fox and Friends, and NPR's Morning Edition. This is unprecedented, she told her editor, Frank Morrison, Pete's nephew and the paper's owner. I've got interview requests from 63 different outlets. The Washington Post wants to send a team. CBS is driving up from Pittsburgh. Frank, 72 and still wearing the same press hat he'd bought in 1975, looked bewildered. All this over Danny Kowalski being an ass? Hell, half the town's known that for years. It's not about Danny anymore, Frank. It's about what he represents. Look at these comments. Maria scrolled through her phone, reading snippets aloud. This is exactly why I left my small town. Every veteran should see how they're really treated. Millbrook should be ashamed. There's even a hashtag calling for a boycott of the entire town. 3 blocks away, Dr. Sarah Harrison was dealing with her own media storm. As the only VA-affiliated mental health professional in a 50-mile radius, she'd become the go-to expert for reporters wanting comment on veteran treatment and PTSD. Her voicemail was full, her email overwhelmed with interview requests and speaking opportunities. She found Dexter Watts in her office waiting room at 7 a.m., holding a cup of coffee that had gone untouched. His prosthetic leg was stretched out at an awkward angle, and the deep circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. "Seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "Hard to miss." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, her professional calm intact despite the chaos. "How are you holding up?" Dexter gestured to her ringing phone. "Feels surreal. Yesterday, I was just trying to have a beer with my buddies. Now I'm the poster child for veteran discrimination." He paused, rubbing his temples. "Jake's getting interview requests from 3 cable news networks. They want me to go on TV, tell my story, make it personal. Do you want to? Hell, I don't know. Part of me wants everyone to see what really happened, but another part..." He trailed off, staring at the coffee cup. "I just wanted to come home, you know. This place was supposed to be safe." Outside the Iron Horse, a small crowd had gathered. By 8 a.m., most were protesters, veterans from neighboring towns, military families, college students from the community college 20 miles away. They carried signs reading "Honor our veterans" and "Shame on Millbrook," chanting slogans that echoed off the empty buildings on Main Street. But not everyone in the crowd supported Dexter. A smaller group of counter-protesters had assembled across the street, their signs reading "Support local business" and "Don't judge until you know." Their leader was Walt Brennan, a Vietnam veteran whose own struggles with alcohol and rage had cost him 2 marriages and a relationship with his children. "I know what that boy went through," Walt told a reporter from the Tribune-Review. "War fucks you up in ways civilians can't understand. Maybe Danny Kowalski was protecting his customers. Maybe he's seen what we can do when we snap." Inside the Iron Horse, Danny had barricaded himself behind the bar, curtains drawn and doors locked. The "closed" sign felt inadequate against the growing crowd outside. His phone rang constantly, reporters, angry veterans, death threats, and surprisingly, messages of support from people who understood his position all too well. Tommy Kowalski stood in the kitchen watching his father drink his 3rd cup of coffee with shaking hands. At 19, Tommy had never seen his father so rattled, so small. The man who'd raised him with stories of hard work and personal responsibility was crumbling under the weight of national scrutiny. "Dad, maybe you should just apologize. Put out a statement or something." Danny's laugh was bitter. "Apologize? You for what? For being honest? For not pretending every soldier is a fucking hero?" He slammed the mug down, coffee sloshing across the zinc bar top. "You think those people out there give a damn about why I did what I did? They just want blood." "But Grandpa, don't!" Danny's voice cut like a blade. "Don't you dare bring him into this. What happened to him, what he became. That's exactly why I did what I did. I won't have another broken soldier taking his pain out on innocent people." Tommy's phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend, Jessica. She was at Penn State, watching the story unfold on social media with her dorm mates. The message was simple. "Is that really your dad? How could he do that to a veteran?" The generational divide was playing out in living rooms across Millbrook. Kids home from college confronted parents who'd remained silent about their own prejudices. High school students shared the video with commentary that made their elders uncomfortable. The town's comfortable assumptions about patriotism and support for veterans were being dissected by people who'd grown up with social media and had no patience for coded language or willful ignorance. Mayor Pat O'Brien called an emergency meeting for 10 a.m., but by then the damage was spreading beyond containment. The story had legs because it confirmed what millions of Americans suspected about the gap between patriotic rhetoric and actual support for veterans. Millbrook shame became a rallying cry for advocates who'd been fighting for veteran services, mental health funding, and honest conversations about war's cost. Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, Danny's 78-year-old mother, had been silent since the video surfaced. She'd lived in the apartment above the bar for 12 years, ever since her husband died, and left her with more medical bills than savings. She'd heard every word of the confrontation, felt the floorboards vibrate as 12 soldiers marched across her kitchen ceiling. Now she sat at her kitchen table, holding a Purple Heart in a worn velvet box. Her husband's Purple Heart, earned in a rice paddy outside Da Nang in 1968. The medal he'd never talked about, never displayed, never acknowledged except to her in moments of drunken confession about the things he'd done and seen. The phone rang. Reporters wanting comment, neighbors seeking gossip, family members from distant states who'd seen the news. She let it ring, staring at the medal and remembering the man who'd earned it. 20-year-old Danny Kowalski, whose letters home had been full of hope and determination. The same man who'd returned 2 years later hollow-eyed and prone to rages that would define the next 30 years of their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her son had discriminated against a veteran while his father's Purple Heart sat in a drawer, hidden like a shameful secret. The cycle of trauma that had started in a Vietnamese preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jungle had somehow led to this moment, this viral explosion of anger and judgment that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. By noon, Millbrook's story was no longer its own. It belonged to the internet now, to the millions of people who would use Danny Kowalski's prejudice to confirm their own beliefs about small-town America, veteran care, and the hollowness of patriotic displays. The town that had prided itself on supporting the troops would have to confront the uncomfortable truth that good intentions and flag displays weren't enough. The real reckoning was just beginning. The breaking point came on the third day, when Mrs. Agnes Kowalski descended the narrow stairs from her apartment, carrying a shoebox that hadn't been opened in 15 years. Her arthritic hands trembled as she set it on the bar where her son sat hunched over his fourth whiskey of the morning, staring at death threats mixed with hate mail from across the country. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying the authority that only mothers possess. "We need to talk." Danny looked up through bloodshot eyes. He'd aged a decade in 72 hours, his face gaunt and stubbled, his usual bluster replaced by hollow exhaustion. Outside, the protesters were smaller in number but louder in their condemnation, their chants a constant reminder of his public shame. "Ma, not now, I can't." "Open the box!" Her tone brooked no argument. Danny's hands shook as he lifted the cardboard lid, revealing layers of tissue paper that crumbled at his touch. Beneath lay his father's Purple Heart, the metal tarnished but still gleaming against its faded ribbon. Next to it were newspaper clippings, yellow with age, documenting Danny Kowalski's heroism. Local man saves squad under fire. Millbrook, soldier earns nation's honor. "Your father never wanted you to see these," Agnes said, settling onto the bar stool beside him. "Said the war was over, no point in living in the past. But the past never left us, did it?" Danny stared at the medal, his throat constricting. He never said, "I never knew he was decorated." Bronze Star, too, and a combat infantry badge. Agnes's voice was steady, but tears tracked down her cheeks. He saved 8 men in that rice paddy, carried 3 of them to safety while enemy fire tore up the ground around him, the citations in there somewhere. Tommy emerged from the kitchen, drawn by his grandmother's voice. He'd never seen the medals either, had only heard fragments of stories about his grandfather's service, usually shouted during his parents' late-night arguments about money and drinking. Why didn't he ever talk about it? Tommy asked, moving closer to examine the Purple Heart. Agnes laughed bitterly. Talk about what? The nightmares that woke him up screaming? The way he'd hit the ground when a car backfired? The friends he watched die? She picked up a photograph from the box, young Stanley in dress greens, smiling with the confidence of a man who hadn't yet learned what war could do. This boy went to Vietnam. Someone else came back. The room fell silent, except for the muffled chanting outside. Danny lifted the Purple Heart, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small thing to represent such enormous suffering. He'd sit in that corner booth, Agnes continued, pointing to the darkest section of the bar. After closing time, just drinking and staring at nothing. Sometimes he'd tell me things about villages they'd burned, children caught in crossfire, the smell of napalm. He said the worst part wasn't killing the enemy. It was coming home and having everyone expect him to be grateful for the experience. Tommy pulled out his phone and began searching. Within minutes, he'd found Danny Kowalski's service record online, digitized by the National Archives. The citations were all there, moments of extraordinary courage documented in crisp military language that couldn't capture the terror or the cost. Jesus, Tommy whispered, reading aloud. The Bronze Star citation says he repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire while directing the evacuation of wounded personnel, displaying exceptional valor and selfless dedication to his fellow soldiers. Danny's hands clenched into fists. Then why was he such a bastard at home? Why did he take it out on us? Because he never got help, Agnes said simply. This was 1970. PTSD didn't have a name yet. Shell shock was what cowards got. Real men were supposed to come home and get on with their lives. She touched the Purple Heart gently. The government gave him this medal and a disability check and told him to be grateful. Nobody asked what he needed to heal. Across town, Dr. Sarah Harrison was having a similar conversation with Elena Rodriguez in her office. Elena had driven down from Pittsburgh after seeing the latest media coverage, concerned about the toll the national attention was taking on her former soldiers and the community. The pattern repeats itself generation after generation, Sarah explained, pulling up statistics on her computer. Untreated trauma becomes family trauma. Children of veterans are twice as likely to develop anxiety disorders, 3 times more likely to struggle with substance abuse. They learn that violence and emotional dysfunction are normal responses to stress. Elena studied the data, her expression grim. You think Danny's prejudice comes from his father's untreated PTSD? I think Danny watched his father destroy himself and everyone around him and never understood that his father was sick, not evil. When he sees a veteran with visible wounds, he doesn't see heroism. He sees the potential for violence and chaos that defined his childhood. That doesn't excuse what he did to Dexter. No, it doesn't, but it explains it, and maybe understanding can lead to healing instead of just punishment. Back at the Iron Horse, Agnes was sharing memories that had been locked away for decades. She told them about the night Stanley came home from the war, how he'd seemed fine for the first few weeks before the nightmares started. About the time he'd grabbed Danny's wrist so hard it left bruises, thinking the 8-year-old was an enemy soldier. About the suicide attempt that nobody outside the family ever knew about. He tried to get help once, she said. Went to the VA hospital in Pittsburgh. They gave him pills that made him worse and told him to stop dwelling on the past, said he should focus on being grateful to be alive when so many didn't come home. Tommy was recording everything on his phone, understanding instinctively that these stories needed to be preserved. His girlfriend Jessica was driving up from Penn State, having seen the news coverage, and wanted to support him. But he wondered if she'd understand the complexity of what his family had endured. "I'm not making excuses for what I did," Danny said finally, his voice hoarse. "That soldier, Dexter, he didn't deserve what I did to him, but seeing him walk in with those scars, that prosthetic leg, it was like seeing Dad all over again. The anger, the unpredictability, the way everyone around him had to walk on eggshells." Agnes reached across and took her son's hand. "Your father wasn't angry because he was evil, Daniel. He was angry because he was in pain and didn't know how to express it any other way. The war never ended for him. It just moved from Vietnam to our living room." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Through the window, they could see Reverend Johnson from St. Matthew's Lutheran, the church where 3 generations of Kowalskis had been baptized and buried. Behind him stood Maria Jenner, her reporter's notebook tucked discreetly in her purse. "Agnes asked me to come," Reverend Johnson explained when Danny reluctantly opened the door. "She thought it might be time to tell the whole truth about Stanley, about the family, about how trauma passes from father to son." Maria stepped forward hesitantly. "I know this is difficult, but people need to understand the context. The viral video shows what happened, but not why it happened. Maybe if they knew about your father's service, his struggles." Danny looked at the Purple Heart still clutched in his hand, then at his mother's expectant face, then at his son's hopeful expression. The weight of 3 generations of silence pressed down on him like a physical force. "All right," he said finally, "let's tell them everything." Outside, the protesters continued their chant, unaware that the real story was just beginning to emerge from decades of buried shame and unspoken trauma. The Millbrook High School gymnasium had never hosted anything like this. 600 folding chairs arranged in military precision faced a makeshift stage where Mayor Pat O'Brien sat flanked by American flags and a banner reading community dialogue on veteran support. But the orderly setup belied the tension crackling. Through the overheated space, where neighbors who'd known each other for decades now eyed one another with suspicion and barely contained anger. CNN had 3 cameras positioned around the room. NPR's microphones captured every cough and whisper. The story that had started with one man's prejudice had become a national referendum on how America really treats its veterans, and Millbrook found itself under a microscope it had never asked for. Dexter Watts sat in the front row, his prosthetic legs stretched out in the narrow aisle. The weight of unwanted celebrity pressed down on his shoulders like body armor. Beside him, Elena Rodriguez wore her dress blues, the ribbons on her chest telling stories of deployments to places most people couldn't pronounce. Dr. Sarah Harrison had positioned herself strategically between the veteran supporters and the townspeople, ready to intervene if emotions boiled over. "Before we begin," Mayor O'Brien announced, his voice echoing through the gymnasium's ancient PA system, "I want to remind everyone that we're here to have a respectful dialogue about how our community can better serve our veterans. This is not a trial, and it's not a spectacle for the cameras." But it felt like both. The gymnasium buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either breakthroughs or breakdowns. Maria Jenner, now fielding calls from publishers interested, in her first-hand account, scanned the crowd with a journalist's eye for the story beneath the story. Danny Kowalski entered through the back doors at exactly 7 o'clock, flanked by his mother and son. The room's conversation died as heads turned to track his progress down the center aisle. His face was pale, but determined, carrying a manila folder that contained copies of his father's military records and citations. Behind him, Agnes Kowalski walked with the dignity of a woman who'd spent 50 years keeping family secrets and had finally decided to let them see daylight. The sight of Danny triggered an immediate reaction. Veterans in the crowd shifted forward in their seats. A group of college students from the community college began a low chant, "Shame! Shame! Shame!" But other voices rose to meet them. Townspeople who'd known the Kowalski family for generations, who remembered Stanley's drinking and violence, who understood that trauma had layers. "Enough!" Reverend Johnson's voice boomed from the podium where he'd been asked to facilitate. "We're here to listen, not to judge. Everyone in this room has a story. Tonight we tell them." He called Dexter to speak first. The veteran moved slowly to the front, his gait uneven but proud. The cameras tracked every step, broadcasting his courage to millions of viewers who'd followed the story from its viral beginning. "5 years ago, I came home from Iraq thinking the hard part was over," Dexter began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I thought if I could survive an IED, learn to walk again, deal with the nightmares, I could handle anything. But what I couldn't handle was coming back to a community that supported the troops in theory, but couldn't look at the reality of what war does to people." He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Danny's. "I don't blame Mr. Kowalski for being afraid. War should scare people. Combat veterans should make civilians uncomfortable because we've seen things and done things that no one should have to see or do. But fear isn't an excuse for discrimination, and discomfort isn't a reason to turn your back on people who served." The applause started with the veterans and spread unevenly through the crowd. Some sections remained silent, arms crossed, faces skeptical. The divide in the room was as clear as battle lines. When Danny took the podium 20 minutes later, carrying his father's Purple Heart in its worn velvet box, the silence was complete. He'd rehearsed this moment for hours, but facing 600 people and 3 television cameras made his prepared words feel inadequate. "My name is Daniel Kowalski," he began, his voice barely carrying to the back rows. "3 days ago, I refused service to a decorated combat veteran, and I want to tell you why." He opened the folder with shaking hands, pulling out the photograph of his father in dress greens. "This is Stanley Kowalski, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Infantry Badge. He served with honor in Vietnam, saved 8 men under fire, and came home to a country that gave him a medal and told him to get on with his life." The room leaned forward as Danny's voice grew stronger. "But the man who came back wasn't the man who left. For 30 years my father fought a war in our living room. He drank to quiet the voices. He raged because he couldn't explain the pain. He died at 56, his liver destroyed, his family broken, his service forgotten by everyone except my mother, who kept his medals in a shoebox because he couldn't bear to look at them." Agnes Kowalski watched from the front row as her son exposed wounds that had festered for decades. Tommy recorded every word, understanding that this confession might be the key to breaking the cycle that had defined 3 generations of their family. "When Sergeant Watts walked into my bar, I didn't see a hero," Danny continued. "I saw my father. I saw the potential for violence, for unpredictability, for the kind of chaos that terrorized my childhood. I was wrong to refuse him service, wrong to let my fear override my decency. But I want you to understand that my prejudice didn't come from hatred, it came from trauma." The gymnasium erupted. Veterans shouted questions about accountability. Townspeople demanded to know why trauma excused discrimination. College students live-streamed reactions to their social media followers. The cameras captured it all, the messy, complicated reality of a community trying to reconcile its ideals with its failures. Dr. Sarah Harrison took the microphone next, her clinical voice cutting through the chaos. "What we're witnessing tonight is exactly why we need to have these conversations," she said. Trauma doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but understanding trauma can prevent future harm. Mr. Kowalski's actions were wrong, but they were also predictable. If you understand the psychology of inherited pain. Elena Rodriguez was the last to speak, her military bearing commanding respect, even from those who disagreed with her presence. The military taught me that mission success requires understanding your environment, she said. If we want to successfully reintegrate veterans into civilian communities, we need to understand the fears and misconceptions that create barriers. Tonight, we've heard hard truths from both sides. The question is, what do we do with that understanding? The meeting ended without resolution, but with something more valuable, a recognition that the viral video had revealed symptoms of deeper problems that couldn't be solved with simple condemnation or easy forgiveness. As people filed out into the November night, conversations continued in small groups, voices heated but engaged. Tommy Kowalski caught up with Dexter in the parking lot, his phone still recording. "I know my dad was wrong," he said. "But I want you to know that not everyone in our family agrees with what he did. Some of us are trying to be better." Dexter studied the young man's face, seeing sincerity beneath the nervousness. "Being better is all any of us can do," he replied. "The question is whether we're willing to do the work." Inside the gymnasium, maintenance workers stacked chairs and swept up the detritus of democracy. Crumpled programs, discarded coffee cups, the physical remnants of a community's attempt to confront its own contradictions. The real work of healing would happen in living rooms and coffee shops, in one-on-one conversations between people who'd learned that supporting veterans required more than parades and flag displays. The viral moment was over. The long, slow work of change was just beginning. The basement of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church had hosted its share of difficult conversations over the decades. Marriage counseling sessions, grief support groups, AA meetings that stretched deep into the night. But the circle of folding chairs, arranged around a simple wooden table, had never contained quite this combination of pain and possibility. Elena Rodriguez sat across from Danny Kowalski, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that emphasized the lines of exhaustion around both their eyes. Dr. Sarah Harrison occupied the mediator's chair, her notebook open, but pen resting idle. Reverend Johnson had offered the space and his presence, understanding that some reconciliations required neutral ground and divine patience. 3 weeks had passed since the town hall, 3 weeks of media attention gradually shifting to newer outrages while Millbrook was left to deal with the aftermath. The protesters had mostly gone home, but the divisions they'd highlighted remained, carved into the bedrock of relationships that had taken generations to build. "I want to start by acknowledging why we're here," Dr. Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd mediated between wounded warriors and resistant communities before. "This isn't about forgiveness or absolution. This is about understanding how we move forward together." Danny's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the coffee mug Reverend Johnson had provided. He'd lost 20 pounds in 3 weeks, the stress carving his face into sharper angles. The Iron Horse remained closed, its future uncertain as suppliers reconsidered contracts and long-time customers stayed away. "I've been thinking about what you said at the town hall," he told Dexter, who sat with his prosthetic leg stretched out under the table, "about not blaming me for being afraid. But I wonder if you really meant that, or if you were just trying to be the bigger man." Dexter considered the question carefully. The viral fame had brought speaking opportunities and interview requests, but also sleepless nights and panic attacks triggered by camera flashes and sudden questions. "I meant it," he said finally, "but being afraid and acting on that fear are different things. My therapist, Dr. Harrison here, She's helped me understand that trauma responses aren't character flaws, but they're our responsibility to manage. Eleanor leaned forward, her elbows on the table. Can I tell you something about fear, Mr. Kowalski? In Iraq, I was afraid every single day. Afraid of IEDs, afraid of snipers, afraid of making the wrong decision and getting my soldiers killed. But the military teaches you that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being terrified. Easy for you to say, Danny replied, a flash of his old defensiveness surfacing. You chose to face that fear. I was 8 years old when mine started. The room fell silent. Dr. Sarah made a note, recognizing the breakthrough moment when defensive walls began to crack. Tell us about that fear, Danny. Help us understand what 8-year-old you experienced. Danny's breathing became shallow, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table. Christmas morning, 1982. Dad had been drinking since Thanksgiving, getting worse every day. Mom made this big breakfast, trying to keep things normal for me and my sister. Dad came downstairs in his bathrobe, saw the presents under the tree, and just snapped. He paused, swallowing hard. Started screaming. About waste, about how we didn't deserve gifts when his buddies were dead in Vietnamese mud. Through the tree across the room, ornaments shattering everywhere. Mum tried to calm him down, and he grabbed her wrist, twisted it until she cried. That's when I learned that uniforms didn't make you safe. They made you dangerous. Reverend Johnson reached across the table and touched Danny's shoulder gently. You never told me that story in all the years I've known your family. Mum made me promise never to tell anyone. Said it would hurt Dad's reputation, make people think less of his service. Danny's laugh was bitter. Took me 40 years to realize that protecting his reputation meant letting his sickness define how I saw every veteran who walked through my door. Dexter shifted in his chair, his own memories stirring. I broke a TV remote 3 months after. I got back, he said quietly. Couldn't figure out how to change the channel, got frustrated, snapped it in half. My girlfriend, ex-girlfriend now, she looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was something to be afraid of. The difference, Elena said carefully, is that you recognized the problem and got help. Danny's father never got that chance. Dr. Sarah seized the opening. That's exactly why we're here, to break the cycle. Danny, your father's untreated. Trauma created your trauma, which led to discrimination against Dexter, but we can stop it here. We can choose understanding over fear. Agnes Kowalski knocked softly on the basement door, carrying a plate of sandwiches and her son's military records in a manila folder. At 78, she moved slowly but with purpose, her presence immediately changing the room's energy. I hope you don't mind the interruption, she said, setting the food on the table, but I thought you should see something. She opened the folder and withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1971, Local Veteran Struggles with Readjustment. The article, buried on page 6 of the Millbrook Gazette, detailed Stanley Kowalski's arrest for public intoxication and disturbing the peace outside the American Legion Hall. I found this cleaning out old boxes, Agnes explained. The reporter interviewed 3 other Vietnam veterans who were having similar problems. Look at the names. Elena studied the article, her expression growing grim. Walt Brennan, Frank Morrison, Jack Sullivan. She looked up at the group. These are all names I recognize from the counter-protests, men who defended Danny's actions. They're all dead now except Walt, Agnes continued. Frank drank himself to death in 89. Jack put a gun in his mouth in 95. My Stanley lasted until 2001, but the war killed him just the same. All of them came home broken, and none of them got help. The revelation settled over the room like dust after an explosion. The pattern was clear. Trauma left untreated became a generational inheritance, passed down through families and communities until Discrimination felt like protection, and fear masqueraded as wisdom. Tommy Kowalski appeared in the doorway, still in his hardware store uniform. "Sorry I'm late. Had to close up." He looked around the circle nervously. "Jessica's upstairs, if that's okay. She wanted to understand what our family's been through." Danny nodded, too emotionally drained to object. His son's girlfriend had been surprisingly supportive, using her journalism major to help research the broader patterns of veteran mistreatment in small Pennsylvania towns. Her generation approached trauma with a directness that both intimidated and inspired their elders. "I've been thinking about what Dad said at the town hall," Tommy continued, taking an empty chair, "about trauma not excusing discrimination. And I think that's right, but I also think understanding trauma can prevent discrimination. If people knew the real cost of war, not just on soldiers, but on their families and communities, maybe they'd demand better support systems." Elena exchanged glances with Dr. Sarah, both recognizing the wisdom in the young man's words. "What would that look like practically?" Elena asked. "I don't know yet," Tommy admitted. "But maybe we start here. Maybe we figure out how to turn the Iron Horse into something that actually supports veterans instead of just serving them beer." Danny looked at his son with surprise. "The bar's probably finished, Tommy. I can't see how we come back from this." "Maybe we don't come back," Tommy replied. "Maybe we move forward instead." Dr. Sarah closed her notebook, sensing that the real work was beginning to emerge from the ruins of old assumptions. What would moving forward look like for everyone? Here, the question hung in the basement air, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Outside, Millbrook continued its daily routines, but in this small circle of wounded people, something new was taking shape. Not forgiveness exactly, but the harder work of building understanding between enemies who discovered they shared more than they'd ever imagined. The basement that had hosted so many difficult conversations was about to witness its most challenging transformation yet. The slow, painful work of turning trauma into wisdom, fear into compassion, and isolation into community. Spring arrived early in Millbrook, and with it came the sound of power tools and possibility. The Iron Horse, closed for 4 months while lawyers, insurance adjusters, and community activists negotiated its future, buzzed with activity as contractors tore out decades of accumulated grime and installed new lighting, fresh drywall, and flooring that hadn't seen beer stains. Elena Rodriguez stood in the center of what had once been the main bar room, wearing work clothes and safety glasses, directing the installation of a wheelchair-accessible ramp that would connect the entrance to the new meeting spaces. The transformation had been her idea, proposed during one of the weekly mediation sessions that had continued long after the media attention faded. "The corner booth goes," she called to the demolition crew, pointing to the darkest section where Danny Kowalski had once nursed his demons. "We're putting in a resource center there. Computers, job search assistance, benefits counseling. Make it bright. Make it welcoming." Danny Kowalski emerged from what had been the kitchen, his hands dusty from installing new cabinets. The past 4 months had changed him as dramatically as the building around him. The weight loss had stabilized, but more importantly, the defensive anger that had defined him for decades had been replaced by something approaching peace. "Elena, we need to talk about the coffee setup," he said, his tone respectful but direct. Their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to collaborative, built on shared purpose rather than forced forgiveness. "Dr. Sarah thinks we need a quiet area for the support groups, somewhere people can have difficult conversations without feeling exposed." Elena nodded, consulting the blueprints spread across a makeshift table. The plans showed a space that honored the Iron Horse's history while transforming its mission entirely. The bar would remain, but serve coffee and meals instead of alcohol. Meeting rooms would occupy spaces where solitary drinkers had once nursed their isolation. The stage where country bands had played would host speakers, support groups, and community forums. Danny Kowalski arrived carrying lunch for the crew, his girlfriend Jessica beside him with a laptop and camera. She'd been documenting the transformation for her senior journalism project, but the story had grown beyond academic requirements. Publishers were interested, and she'd been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to explore how communities could address veteran issues practically rather than symbolically. "How's the Veterans Housing Coordinator search going?" Jessica asked Elena, setting up to conduct another interview. "We've got 3 strong candidates," Elena replied. "All combat veterans, all with experience in social work or counseling. The salary isn't huge, but the county's contributing, and we've got grant applications pending with 5 different foundations." The position had been Tommy's idea, inspired by research into communities that had successfully integrated veteran support into existing infrastructure. Rather than creating another bureaucratic program, they were building something organic. A place where veterans could find practical help, peer support, and a sense of belonging without feeling like charity cases. Dr. Sarah Harrison entered through the new accessible entrance, carrying boxes of reference materials for the lending library they were establishing. Her role had evolved from individual therapist to community healing coordinator, a position that didn't exist in any official capacity but had become essential to the project's success. "The VA confirmed they'll co-locate a counselor here 2 days a week," she announced, setting down the boxes. "We're also getting a part-time benefits advocate and someone who specializes in traumatic brain injury support." The partnerships had been crucial to making the transformation financially viable. The VA's involvement lent credibility and resources. The county's contribution covered utilities and insurance. Local businesses, including several that had initially boycotted the Iron Horse, now supported the renovation through donations and volunteer labor. Agnes Kowalski shuffled in from the back office, where she'd been organizing files for the new Veterans Resource Database. At 79, she'd found unexpected purpose in helping other military families navigate the systems that had failed her husband decades earlier. Her apartment upstairs had been renovated too, but she'd chosen to stay, becoming the project's unofficial grandmother and institutional memory. "The Murphy family called again," she told Elena. "Their boy just got back from Afghanistan, having trouble with nightmares. I scheduled them for Thursday's support group, but they're nervous about coming, think people will judge them for needing help." "I'll call them," Dexter said, emerging from the meeting room where he'd been testing the new audio-visual equipment. His role as peer counselor had developed naturally from his initial involvement in the project. Veterans trusted him because he'd walked their path, and civilians respected him because he'd maintained his dignity throughout the viral controversy. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Funding remained precarious, dependent on grants and donations that could disappear with changing priorities. Some community members remained skeptical, questioning whether the town needed another social service organization, and the work of changing deeply embedded attitudes about veteran issues required constant vigilance. But there were victories, too. Walt Brennan, the Vietnam veteran who'd initially supported Danny's discrimination, had become one of the center's most devoted volunteers after attending a support group session. 3 local veterans had found employment through the job placement program. 2 families had avoided foreclosure through financial counseling services. Maria Jenner arrived to conduct her monthly check-in interview, part of her ongoing coverage of the project's development. The story that had started with viral outrage had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful, an examination of how communities could move beyond symbolic gestures to create meaningful change. What surprised you most about this process? She asked Elena, setting up her recording equipment in the new quiet corner. Elena considered the question while watching Danny teach Tommy how to operate the espresso machine they'd installed where the beer taps used to be. "The resistance wasn't where I expected it," she said finally. "I thought civilians would be the biggest obstacle, but some of the hardest conversations have been with veterans who don't trust anything that seems too good to be true. They've been disappointed so many times that hope feels dangerous." Outside, Millbrook was experiencing its own transformation. The national attention had brought unexpected benefits: tourism from people curious about the town's story, federal grants for infrastructure improvements, academic researchers studying community-based veteran integration. But more importantly, the conversations that had started with conflict had continued with purpose. The high school had added a required course on military history and veteran issues. The library hosted monthly forums on social justice topics. The mayor's office had created a standing committee on veteran affairs with real authority and budget allocation. Changes that might have taken decades to implement had been compressed into months by the urgency of crisis. As evening approached, the renovation crew gathered their tools and prepared to leave. The grand reopening was still 6 weeks away, but the space already felt alive with possibility. The ghosts of Danny Kowalski's pain and Danny's prejudice hadn't been exorcised. They'd been transformed into motivation for something better. Dexter ran his hand along the new bar top, smooth and unmarked by decades of spilled drinks and bitter conversations. "Think it'll work?" he asked Elena. "It's already working," she replied, gesturing to the volunteers sorting donations, the veterans planning programming, the community members who discovered that supporting the troops meant more than flag displays and parade appearances. "The question is whether we can sustain it." That night, after everyone had gone home, Danny remained alone in the transformed space. He sat where his father's corner booth had been, now bright and welcoming, and thought about the journey from shame to purpose. The viral video that had nearly destroyed his life had become the catalyst for something he could never have imagined, a chance to honor his father's service by ensuring other veterans didn't suffer in silence. The Iron Horse was ready to serve its community again, but this time with a mission that went beyond quenching thirst to healing wounds that had festered too long in darkness. The delegation from Cedar Falls, Iowa, arrived on a Tuesday morning. In October, their rental van pulling up outside the Iron Horse Veterans Community Center just as the breakfast rush was ending. Mayor Patricia Hernandez stepped out first, followed by 3 city council members, a VA regional coordinator, and Dr. Marcus Williams, a sociologist from the University of Iowa who'd been studying community-based veteran integration models. Elena Rodriguez met them at the entrance, now accustomed to these visits that had become monthly occurrences. Word had spread through professional networks, academic conferences, and congressional hearings about what Millbrook had accomplished. The small Pennsylvania town had become an unlikely laboratory for addressing veteran issues at the community level. "Welcome to the Iron Horse," Eleanor said, shaking hands with each visitor. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, Community Coordinator. Danny Kowalski, our Executive Director, will join us shortly. He's upstairs meeting with a family that just moved here from Michigan specifically to access our services." The transformation was immediately visible. Where beer taps had once stood, a gleaming coffee bar served locally roasted beans alongside breakfast sandwiches prepared by a culinary training program for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The dark corners where solitary drinkers had nursed their pain now hosted bright workstations where veterans collaborated on resumes, business plans, and college applications. The key insight, Elena explained as she led the tour, was understanding that veteran issues aren't separate from community issues. Housing, employment, mental health, substance abuse, these affect everyone. When we design solutions for veterans, we strengthen the entire community's social infrastructure. Dr. Williams took extensive notes as they visited the financial counseling office, where two families were working through debt consolidation plans. The Corner Resource Center buzzed with activity as veterans used computers for job searches and online education programs. In the back meeting room, a support group for military spouses discussed the challenges of repeated deployments and their effects on children. "What's the annual budget for all this?" asked Cedar Falls finance director, clearly trying to calculate feasibility. "Surprisingly modest," Danny answered, joining the group after his upstairs meeting. At 53, he carried himself with quiet confidence, his transformation as remarkable as the building around him. "We're at $340,000 annually, but that includes 3 full-time positions and programming that serves the entire Tri-County area. The secret is leveraging partnerships rather than duplicating services." Mayor Hernandez studied the organizational chart Elena provided. "You're coordinating with 17 different agencies." 18 now, Elena corrected. "We just partnered with the State Veterans Employment Commission to place a job counselor here 2 days a week. The beauty of this model is that it reduces bureaucratic redundancy while increasing accessibility. Veterans don't have to drive 3 hours to Pittsburgh for services anymore." Danny Kowalski, now 21, and serving as the center's outreach coordinator while finishing his degree online, approached carrying a stack of program evaluations. His evolution from conflicted teenager to confident advocate illustrated how the center had affected multiple generations. "The data tells the story," he said, handing Mayor Hernandez a spiral-bound report. "Veteran unemployment in our region has dropped from 18% to 6% over 2 years. Suicide rates are down 34%. Property values have actually increased because the community has become more attractive to military families planning retirement." The delegation spent the afternoon interviewing program participants. They met James Morrison, a Marine veteran who'd launched a successful landscaping business through the center's entrepreneurship program. Sarah Chen, an Air Force veteran, explained how the career counseling services had helped her transition from military intelligence to civilian IT work at a local hospital. Most compelling was the story of Michael Brennan, Walt's 30-year-old son, who'd returned from 2 deployments in Afghanistan, struggling with PTSD and alcohol dependency. The traditional VA treatment model had failed him repeatedly, but the peer support and community integration approach at the Iron Horse had provided the foundation for his recovery. "It wasn't just the counseling," Michael explained to the visitors. "It was having a place where I could contribute, where my military experience was seen as an asset rather than a liability. I started volunteering, then got trained as a peer counselor. Now I coordinate the crisis intervention program." Dr. Williams was particularly interested in the intergenerational aspects of the model. "We're seeing reduced trauma transmission," he noted, after interviewing Agnes Kowalski, now 80 and still managing the family resource database. "When veterans get support, their children and spouses benefit. The community mental health indicators have improved across all demographics." The financial sustainability remained a constant challenge, but the center had diversified its funding streams strategically. Federal grants provided base funding, corporate sponsorships covered specific programs, and fee-for-service contracts with neighboring counties generated operating revenue. The model was replicable because it didn't require massive initial investment, just community commitment and creative partnerships. As the day concluded, Mayor Hernandez pulled Elena aside. "How do you handle the skeptics? We've got council members who think veteran issues are the federal government's responsibility." Elena smiled, remembering her own journey from anger to advocacy. We don't argue ideology, we demonstrate results. When the unemployment rate drops, property values rise, and emergency services calls decrease, even skeptics notice. Plus, when you help veterans, you're helping their families, their neighbors, their employers. The benefits ripple through the entire community. That evening, Jessica Patterson, now a correspondent for a national magazine, moderated a panel discussion that had become a monthly feature. The topic was Sustaining Innovation, Lessons from 2 Years of Community Transformation. The panelists included Elena, Danny, Dr. Sarah Harrison, and surprisingly Walt Brennan, whose journey from bitter opponent to dedicated volunteer had become part of the center's founding mythology. The hardest part isn't starting change, Walt reflected, his voice carrying the weight of earned wisdom. It's maintaining momentum when the cameras leave and the crisis feeling fades. You have to institutionalize the caring, make it part of how the community operates normally. The audience included the visiting delegation, local residents, and veterans who'd traveled from neighboring states to learn about replicating the model. Questions ranged from practical concerns about funding and staffing to philosophical discussions about the role of community responsibility in addressing systemic problems. Maria Jenner, whose Pulitzer Prize nomination for her coverage of the transformation had brought national recognition to her small-town reporting, asked the closing question, "What would you tell communities that want to start this work, but don't? Have a viral incident to catalyze change?" Elena considered carefully before responding, "Crisis isn't a prerequisite for caring. Every community has veterans, and every community has unmet needs. You don't need a dramatic incident to start." Asking better questions. Are we really supporting our veterans, or just saying we support them? What would real support look like? How do we move from symbolic gestures to substantive action? Danny nodded, adding, "And remember that this isn't about perfection. We made mistakes. We still make mistakes. The difference is that now we're making them while trying to do better, rather than making them while avoiding difficult truths." As the delegation prepared to leave the next morning, Dr. Williams compiled his preliminary assessment. The Millbrook model wasn't just about veteran services, it was about community resilience, social cohesion, and the practical application of collective responsibility. The lessons were applicable far beyond veteran issues. "You've created something remarkable here," he told Elena as their van loaded up. "Not just for veterans, but for democracy itself. You've shown that communities can address complex problems when they're willing to move beyond blame and toward collaboration." 6 months later, Cedar Falls would open its own veteran community center, followed by similar initiatives in Ohio, Montana, and North Carolina. The ripple effects of one discriminatory act had spread from viral shame to sustainable change, proving that communities could transform their worst impulses into their greatest strengths. The Iron Horse had become more than a building or a program. It had become a proof of concept for what America could be when it chose to honor its values with action rather than just words. 2 years to the day after Jake Williams' livestream went viral, the Iron Horse Veterans Community Center hosted its first annual National Veterans Integration Conference. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered that cold November evening when 12 soldiers in dress blues had walked through these same doors, seeking nothing more than acknowledgement of their brother's dignity. The morning keynote address drew a packed house, 300 attendees from 42 states, representing community leaders, veterans advocates, academic researchers, and federal policymakers. The audience included Senator Patricia Martinez from Colorado, who'd introduced legislation based on the Millbrook model, and Dr. James Harrison from the Department of Veterans Affairs, who'd spent 6 months studying community-based integration programs. Elena Rodriguez took the podium wearing her dress blues one final time, before transitioning to civilian clothes permanently. Her promotion to full colonel had come with an offer to head the Army's new community integration initiative, but she'd chosen instead to remain in Millbrook as the executive director of the non-profit organization that had grown from the center's success. 2 years ago, I stood in this room facing a man whose fear had turned to discrimination, Elena began, her voice carrying to the overflow crowd in the adjacent meeting rooms. Today, that same man sits in the front row as my co-keynote speaker, and one of the most effective veteran advocates I've ever known. If that transformation is possible, then anything is possible. Danny Kowalski rose from his seat, still lean but no longer gaunt, his face bearing the calm confidence of someone who'd found purpose after decades of misdirection. The applause was warm and sustained, recognizing not just his personal journey, but what his transformation represented for communities struggling with similar issues. "I want to start with an apology," Danny said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Not just to Dexter Watts, though he deserves the first and most sincere apology, but to every veteran who's walked into a bar, a restaurant, a workplace, a classroom, and felt the weight of unspoken judgments and unexamined fears." He paused, scanning the crowd until he found familiar faces. Dr. Sarah Harrison in the third row, Agnes Kowalski beaming from her wheelchair near the accessible seating area, Tommy and Jessica taking notes for the documentary they were producing about the conference. "My father served with distinction in Vietnam and came home to a country that gave him a medal and told him to get on with his life. No one asked what he needed to heal. No one understood that his anger was pain, that his drinking was self-medication, that his isolation was a symptom of trauma, not a character flaw. The community that should have supported him instead enabled his suffering through willful ignorance." The confession still carried weight, even after hundreds of retellings, but now it served a different purpose, not just acknowledgement of harm done, but illustration of harm that could be prevented. The transformation of the Iron Horse wasn't about forgiveness, Danny continued. It was about understanding. Understanding that veteran issues are community issues. Understanding that supporting the troops requires more than flag displays and parade participation. Understanding that real patriotism means caring for the people who've carried the burden of our national decisions. When Dexter Watts joined them on stage, the symbolism was complete but not forced. His role as the center's peer counseling coordinator had evolved naturally from his initial involvement, and his expertise in trauma recovery was now recognized nationally. The prosthetic leg that had once symbolized difference now represented resilience. "Change is possible," Dexter said simply, "but it requires communities willing to examine their assumptions and individuals brave enough to face their fears." Danny and I didn't become friends overnight. We became collaborators in the work of healing his trauma, my trauma, our community's trauma. The panel that followed included voices from the 12 communities that had implemented variations of the Millbrook model. Cedar Falls reported a 40% reduction in veteran homelessness. Spokane had eliminated their veteran services waiting list through community partnerships. A rural Montana town had prevented 3 veteran suicides through their crisis intervention program. But the most powerful presentation came from Dr. Marcus Williams, whose longitudinal study had tracked the broader community impacts of veteran integration initiatives. His data showed reduced domestic violence rates, improved educational outcomes for military children, increased civic participation, and strengthened social cohesion. What Millbrook discovered, Dr. Williams explained, is that addressing veteran needs comprehensively strengthens the entire social fabric. When you create systems that support people dealing with trauma, economic transition, and social reintegration, everyone benefits. During the lunch break, Agnes Kowalski held court at a corner table, sharing stories with a group of military spouses and veteran family members. At 81, she'd become an unexpected icon, her journey from silent keeper of family secrets to vocal advocate, inspiring others to break cycles of inherited trauma. "The shame nearly killed us," she told a young wife whose husband was struggling with PTSD. "3 generations of keeping secrets, pretending everything was fine while our family fell apart in private. But shame thrives in darkness. Once we started talking, started asking for help, everything changed." The afternoon breakout sessions covered practical topics: funding strategies, partnership development, crisis intervention protocols, and outcome measurement. But they also addressed deeper questions about community responsibility, social justice, and the true meaning of patriotism in a democracy that sends its citizens to war. Jake Williams, now a successful documentary filmmaker, screened his latest project, After the Stream: How Viral Moments Become Lasting Change. The film followed 6 communities that had experienced viral incidents around social justice issues, examining which had translated crisis into sustainable reform and which had simply weathered the storm without learning. "The difference," Jake concluded, "is leadership that chooses growth over defensiveness, communities that choose examination over denial, and individuals who choose vulnerability over self-protection." As evening approached, the conference concluded with a ceremony that honored both progress made and work still to be done. The original viral video was screened, not for shock value, but as a reminder of how quickly discrimination can be exposed, and how slowly understanding develops. Maria Jenner, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning series on the transformation had launched her career at the Washington Post, served as master of ceremonies. Her opening remarks acknowledged the surreal nature of celebrating what had begun as a moment of community shame. "We're not here to celebrate discrimination," she clarified. "We're here to celebrate the possibility of redemption, the power of accountability, and the potential for growth that exists in every community willing to face difficult truths." The evening's highlight was the announcement of the Iron Horse Foundation, a national non-profit that would provide grants and technical assistance to communities developing veteran integration programs. Elena would serve as president, with Danny as program coordinator and Dexter as clinical advisor. Tommy Kowalski, now 22 and about to graduate with a degree in social work, had been selected as the Foundation's first community organizing fellow. His mission would be to work with younger veterans and military families, ensuring that the lessons of Millbrook reached the generation that would inherit the ongoing work of veteran care. "Every generation has to choose whether to repeat the patterns they inherited or create something better," Tommy said during his acceptance speech. "Our generation chooses better." As the conference ended and attendees prepared to return to their communities, small groups gathered throughout the center, exchanging contact information and making plans for collaboration. The networking was organic, driven by shared purpose, rather than professional obligation. In the quiet after the crowds departed, Danny and Dexter found themselves alone in the main room, much as Eleanor and her unit had found Danny alone behind the bar 2 years earlier. But the silence now was comfortable, filled with possibility rather than tension. "Think it'll stick?" Dexter asked, gesturing to the conference materials scattered on tables, the business cards and commitment forms that represented communities ready to begin their own transformation. "Some will, some won't," Danny replied honestly. "Change is hard, and it requires sustained effort long after the initial enthusiasm fades. But we've proved it's possible. We've created a model that works, Now it's up to others to adapt it to their communities. Outside, Millbrook had settled into its evening routine. The town that had once been infamous for discrimination had become synonymous with community healing and veteran support. The transformation hadn't solved every problem or healed every wound, but it had proved that shame could become purpose, crisis could become catalyst, and enemies could become collaborators. The Iron Horse closed its doors at midnight, but the lights remained on in the 24-hour Crisis Intervention Center upstairs, where trained volunteers waited to help veterans in distress. The building that had once symbolized exclusion now represented the radical idea that communities could choose to care for their most vulnerable members. In the apartment above, Agnes Kowalski sat in her favorite chair, reading a letter from a military family in Oregon who'd heard about their work and wanted to start something similar in their town. At 81, she'd lived long enough to see trauma passed down through generations and healing passed forward through communities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new opportunities to choose between fear and understanding. But tonight, in this small Pennsylvania town that had learned to transform its worst impulses into its greatest strengths, the work of building a more compassionate democracy continued, one conversation, one relationship, one healed wound at a time. The circle was complete, but the spiral continued upward. 5 years later, Dexter Watts stood in the Rose Garden, adjusting his tie nervously as President Chen prepared to sign the Community Veterans Integration Act into law. The legislation, inspired by the Millbrook model, would fund similar programs in 200 communities nationwide. "Never thought that viral video would lead to this," Jake whispered, his documentary camera capturing the historic moment. Elena, now a senior advisor on veteran affairs, caught Dexter's eye and smiled. Behind them, Danny held Agnes's hand as she sat in her wheelchair, the 86-year-old woman who'd broken a family's cycle of silence, now witnessing national policy change. The president's pen moved across the paper, but Dexter thought of smaller moments: Tommy graduating social work school, Mrs. Murphy's son finding stable housing, the crisis call that didn't end in tragedy because someone was there to listen. "From a moment of discrimination to an act of Congress," the president said, shaking Dexter's hand. "Proof that one person's courage can change everything." That evening in Millbrook, the Iron Horse served coffee to a new group of veterans. Their story's just beginning. The building hummed with quiet conversations, healing happening one relationship at a time. The work continued, as it always would. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.